Let's get right into this one, because today we're undertaking a truly fascinating and honestly deeply unsettling clinical examination. We are looking at a graphic novel-style psychological case study of extreme body horror and complete identity loss. We're going to examine the tragic story of Matt Hagen, better known as Clayface, and specifically focus on the events surrounding the creation and destruction of a young girl named Annie. Now, this isn't just your standard monster story. It's a profound look at fragmented identity disorder, autonomy, and the terrifying consequences of losing your humanity. So get ready, because this is for sure one of the darkest and most compelling psychological arcs we've ever covered in this explainer.
To methodically investigate this descent into madness, we're going to use a three-act structure. We'll start with the Renuyu case study, move right into Act 1, the fragmented self, then Act 2, conflict of autonomy, Act 3, final dissolution, and finally we'll look at Robin's moral trauma.
Okay, let's dive into this with Section 1, the Renuyu case study, psychological origins.
Clinically speaking, we're looking at an extreme, literalized manifestation of fragmented identity disorder. When we look at other tragic villains like Harvey Dent, Two-Face, we see a psychological splitting of the self as a way to cope with severe trauma. But Hagen's condition is uniquely horrifying because his mind and body literally break apart. He is entirely losing the ability to maintain a single cohesive form, both physically and mentally. His identity is quite literally dissolving into mud.
And just look at the tragic irony of his condition. The chemical that mutated him was literally called Renuyu. It was supposed to heal and renew his face. Yet, the twisted reality is that this promised cosmetic salvation has now forced him to manufacture an entirely separate person just to interact with a world that completely rejects his monstrous form. He's trapped in a biological nightmare of his own making.
Act 1, the fragmented self, physical and mental fallout.
Clinically tracking this, we see a really clear, really desperate progression. Step 1 is massive physical instability. Hagen can no longer hold his shape. Step 2 is the literal breaking apart of his mass. And step 3, well, as a desperate survival mechanism, he spawns a small clay girl who comes to be known as Annie. And her purpose? To act as a sort of biological drone, scouting the city to make absolutely sure it's safe for the core Clayface entity to emerge. He's literally splintering himself just to survive.
But Annie becomes something much, much more profound than just a simple scout. She represents the absolute last vestige of Hagen's innocence. This is the detached, highly vulnerable part of his psyche that still remembers what it feels like to be human. By separating her from his main body, he's inadvertently separated the last pure part of his soul from the monster he's become. She's the uncorrupted inner child walking around entirely detached from that toxic core. Which brings us to Act 2, conflict of autonomy, a psychological crisis.
Now, what's really interesting here is that as Annie wanders Gotham, she develops a genuine, independent bond with Tim Drake, Robin. She's gaining a soul and really desiring her own independence. But Hagen's fragmented mind, he just views her as a mere prop, like a stray limb. In earlier cases, Hagen used his shapeshifting to mimic strangers, right? But here, his psychological mimicry turns inward, and it becomes incredibly predatory. He is literally hunting a piece of his own psyche that has dared to find happiness without him.
Think about the intense body horror happening here for Annie. She has to realize she isn't a real girl at all, but merely a biological extension of a killer. Her newfound autonomy is completely at odds with her biological reality. It's genuinely astonishing that a supposedly youth-oriented animated series tackled this level of mature psychological terror. I mean, the absolute horror of being created by someone who has entirely lost their own humanity. It's incredibly dark.
And that leads us to a heavy, somber conclusion. Act 3, final dissolution. To save himself from capture, a cornered Clayface forcibly reabsorbs Annie back into his mass. This act is described perfectly as the ultimate murder of the self. By consuming her to complete his form, Hagen is knowingly consuming his only remaining capacity for love and innocence. He isn't just killing a creation, he is intentionally extinguishing the very last light within his own soul.
And the visual representation of this is just pure theatrical horror. The sight of the girl melting back into the mud is this harrowing visual echo of Hagen's original Renuyu overdose. It is an act of sheer biological survival that completely overrides any lingering sense of humanity. It's deeply disturbing because it's a visual confirmation that the monster has definitively won over the man.
So the crucial point is the trade-off. His physical state is technically whole again. He's reclaimed his lost mass. But his psychological state? He is completely hollow. He's a monster who is now truly, fundamentally alone in his own skin. He traded away his last shred of humanity just to survive another day in the mud. Now, contrast this with another tragic villain like Mr. Freeze. Victor Fries lost his original identity too, but he forged a new, albeit twisted, purpose to save his wife. Hagen, however, has simply erased the best part of himself and replaced it with absolutely nothing.
Finally, let's look at Robin's moral trauma, the collateral damage.
Tim Drake watches this entire sequence unfold, and Robin correctly identifies the reabsorption as a killing. He doesn't see it as a villain simply pulling himself back together. No, he sees a distinct life, a girl he cared for being murdered. Witnessing this grotesque moral atrocity acts as a massive, traumatic catalyst for Robin's worldview. It introduces a level of biological and psychological horror that completely shatters the standard cops and robbers dynamic of his usual crime fighting.
Which leaves us with this final provocative thought to consider. How does witnessing this horrifying murder of the self permanently alter Robin's moral development? When a young hero sees that a person is capable of literally consuming their own innocence, how does that etch permanent psychological scars into their understanding of justice and of evil? It's a heavy question, and one that completely redefines the stakes of this universe. Thanks for joining me for this explainer. Keep analyzing, keep questioning, and I'll catch you next time as we unpack another fascinating case study.